But let me return to a much less beautiful and much less pleasant conversation. You mentioned prison.
Back to X-Risk, okay.
And conditioning. You mentioned something about the state. So, what role, let's talk about companies, governments, parents, all the mechanisms that can be a source of conditioning. Which flavor of ice cream do you like? Do you think the state is the right thing for the future? So governments that are elected, democratic systems that are representing representative democracy. Is there some kind of political system of governance that you find appealing? Is it parents, meaning a very close-knit tribes of conditioning that's the most essential? And then you and Michael Malice would happily agree that it's anarchy, where the state should be dissolved or destroyed or burned to the ground, if you're Michael Malice, giggling, holding the torch as the fire burns. So which is it? Can the state be good, or is the state bad for the conditioning of a beautiful world? A or B? This is like an SAT test.
You like to give these simplified good or bad things. Would I like the state that we live in currently, the United States federal government, to stop existing today? No, I would really not like that. I think that would be not quite bad for the world in a lot of ways. Do I think that it's a optimal social system and maximally just and humane and all those things, and I want it to continue as is? No, also not that. But I am much more interested in it being able to evolve to a better thing without going through the catastrophe phase that I think its just non-existence would give.
So what size of state is good? In the sense, like, should we as a human society, as this world becomes more globalized, should we be constantly striving to reduce we can put on a map, like right now, literally, like the centers of power in the world. Some of them are tech companies, some of them are governments. Should we be trying to, as much as possible, decentralize the power to where it's very difficult to point on a map the centers of power? And that means making the state, however, there's a bunch of different ways to make the government much smaller. That could be reducing, in the United States, reducing the funding for the government, all those kinds of things. There's a set of responsibilities, the set of powers. It could be, I mean, this is far out, but making more nations, or maybe nations not in the space that are defined by geographic location, but rather in the space of ideas, which is what anarchy is about. So anarchy is about forming collectives based on their set of ideas, and doing so dynamically, not based on where you were born and so on.
I think we can say that the natural state of humans, if we want to describe such a thing, was to live in tribes that were below the Dunbar number. Meaning that for a few 100,000 years of human history, all of the groups of humans mostly stayed under that size. And whenever it would get up to that size, it would end up cleaving. And so it seems like there's a pretty strong, but there weren't individual humans out in the wild doing really well, right? So we were a group animal, but with groups that had a specific size. So we could say, in a way, humans were being domesticated by those groups. They were learning how to have certain rules to participate with the group, without which you'd get kicked out. But that's still the wild state of people.
And maybe it's useful to do as a side statement, which I've recently looked at a bunch of papers around Dunbar's number, where the mean is actually 150. If you actually look at the original paper, it's
a range.
It's really a range. So it's actually somewhere under 1,000. So it's a range from like 2 to 500 or whatever it is. But like you could argue that I think it actually is exactly the range is 2 to 520, something like that. And this is the mean that's taken crudely. It's not a very good paper, in terms of the actual numerically speaking. But it'd be interesting if there's a bunch of Dunbar numbers that could be computed for particular environments, particular conditions, so on. It is very true that they're likely to be something small, under 1 million. But it'd be interesting if we can expand that number in interesting ways that will change the fabric of this conversation. I just want to kind of throw that in there. I don't know if the 150 is baked in somehow into the hardware.
We can talk about some of the things that it probably has to do with. Up to a certain number of people, and this is going to be variable based on the social technologies that mediate it to some degree. We can talk about that in a minute. Up to a certain number of people, everybody can know everybody else pretty intimately. So let's go ahead and just take 150 as an average number. Everybody can know everyone intimately enough that if your actions made anyone else do poorly, it's your extended family. And you're stuck living with them, and you know who they are, and there's no anonymous people. There's no just them and over there. And that's one part of what leads to a kind of tribal process where what's good for the individual and good for the whole has a coupling. Also, below that scale, everyone is somewhat aware of what everybody else is doing. There's not groups that are very siloed. And as a result, it's actually very hard to get away with bad behavior. There's a forced kind of transparency. And so you don't need kind of like the state in that way. But lying to people doesn't actually get you ahead. Sociopathic behavior doesn't get you ahead because it gets seen. And so there's a conditioning environment where the individual's behaving in a way that is aligned with the interest of the tribe is what gets conditioned. When it gets to be a much larger system, it becomes easier to hide certain things from the group as a whole, as well as to be less emotionally bound to a bunch of anonymous people. I would say there's also a communication protocol where up to about that number of people, we could all sit around a tribal council and be part of a conversation around a really big decision. Do we migrate? Do we not migrate? Do we, something like that? Do we get rid of this person? And why would I want to agree to be a part of a larger group where everyone can't be part of that council? And so I am going to now be subject to law that I have no say in. If I could be part of a smaller group that could still survive and I get a say in the law that I'm subject to. So I think the cleaving, and a way we can look at it beyond the Dunbar number too, is we can look at that a civilization has binding energy that is holding them together and has cleaving energy. And if the binding energy exceeds the cleaving energy, that civilization will last. And so there are things that we can do to decrease the cleaving energy within the society, things we can do to increase the binding energy. I think naturally we saw that had certain characteristics up to a certain size, kind of tribalism. That ended with a few things. It ended with people having migrated enough that when you started to get resource wars, you couldn't just migrate away easily. And so tribal warfare became more obligated. It involved the plow and the beginning of real economic surplus. There were a few different kind of forcing functions. But we're talking about what size should it be, right? What size should a society be? And I think the idea, like if we think about your body for a moment as a self-organizing complex system that is multi-scaled, we think about...
Our body is a wonderland.
Our body is a wonderland, yeah. That's
a John Mayer song. I apologize, but yes. So if we think about our body and the billions of cells that are in it,
well, you don't have think about how ridiculous it would be to try to have all the tens of trillions of cells in it with no internal organization structure, right? Just like a sea of protoplasm. It wouldn't
pure
work.
Democracy.
And so you have cells and tissues. And then you have tissues and organs and organs and organ systems. And so you have these layers of organization. And then obviously the individual in a tribe, in a ecosystem. And each of the higher layers are both based on the lower layers, but also influencing them. Yeah. I think the future of civilization will be similar, which is there's a level of governance that happens at the level of the individual, my own governance of my own choice. I think there's a level that happens at the level of a family. We're making decisions together. We're inter-influencing each other and affecting each other, taking responsibility for the idea of an extended family. And you can see that for a lot of human history, we had an extended family. We had a local community, a local church, or whatever it was. We had these intermediate structures. Whereas right now, there's kind of the individual producer, consumer, taxpayer, voter. and the massive nation-state global complex, and not that much in the way of intermediate structures that we relate with, and not that much in the way of real personal dynamics, all impersonalized, made fungible. And so I think that we have to have global governance, meaning I think we have to have governance at the scale we affect stuff. And if anybody is messing up the oceans, that matters for everybody. So that can't only be national or only local. Everyone is scared of the idea of global governance because we think about some top-down system of imposition that now has no checks and balances on power. I'm scared of that same version, so I'm not talking about that kind of global governance. It's why I'm even using the word governance as a process rather than government as an imposed phenomena. And so I think we have to have global governance, but I think we also have to have local governance, and there has to be relationships between them that each, where there are both checks and balances in power, flows of information. So I think governance at the level of cities will be a bigger deal in the future than governance at the level of nation states, because I think nation states are largely fictitious things that are defined by wars and agreements to stop wars and like that. I think cities are based on real things that will keep being real, where the proximity of certain things together, the physical proximity of things together, gives increased value of those things. So you look at like Jeffrey West's work on scale and finding that companies and nation states and things that have a kind of complicated agreement structure get diminishing return of production per capita as the total number of people increases beyond about the tribal scale, but the city actually gets increasing productivity per capita. But it's not designed. It's kind of this organic thing, right? So there should be governance at the level of cities because people can sense and actually have some agency there. Probably neighborhoods and smaller scales within it, and also verticals. And some of it won't be geographic. It'll be network-based, right? Networks of affinities. So I don't think the future is one type of governance. Now, what we can say more broadly is, say, when we're talking about groups of people that interaffect each other, the idea of a civilization is that we can figure out how to coordinate our choice-making to not be at war with each other and hopefully increase total productive capacity in a way that's good for everybody. Mm-hmm. Division of labor and specialties, so we all get more, better stuff and whatever. But it's a coordination of our choice-making. I think we can look at civilizations failing on the side of not having enough coordination of choice-making, so they fail on the side of chaos, and then they cleave and an internal war comes about or whatever. Or they can't make smart decisions and they overuse their resources or whatever. Or it can fail on the side of trying to get order via imposition, via force, and so it fails on the side of oppression, which ends up being, for a while, functional-ish for the thing as a whole, but miserable for most people in it until it fails either because of revolt or because it can't innovate enough or something like that. And so there's this like toggling between order via oppression and chaos. And I think the idea of democracy, not the way we've implemented it, but the idea of it, whether we're talking about a representative democracy or a direct digital democracy, liquid democracy, a republic, whatever, the idea of an open society, participatory governance, is can we have order that is emergent rather than imposed so that we aren't stuck with chaos and infighting and inability to coordinate, and we're also not stuck with oppression. And what would it take to have emergent order? This is the most kind of central question for me these days, because if we look at what different nation states are doing around the world, and we see nation states that are more authoritarian, that in some ways are actually coordinating much more effectively. So, for instance, we can see that China has built high-speed rail not just through its country, but around the world, and the U.S. hasn't built any high-speed rail yet. You can see that it brought 300 million people out of poverty in a time where we've had increasing economic inequality happening. You can see like that if there was a single country that could make all of its own stuff, if the global supply chains failed, China would be the closest one to being able to start to go closed loop on fundamental things. Belt and Road Initiative, supply chain on rare earth metals, transistor manufacturing, that is like, oh, they're actually coordinating more effectively in some important ways in the last, call it 30 years. And
that's imposed order.
Imposed order. And we can see that if in the U.S., now let's look at why real quick. We know why we created term limits, so that we wouldn't have forever monarchs. That's the thing we were trying to get away from, and that there would be checks and balances on power and that kind of thing. But that also has created a negative second order effect, which is nobody does long-term planning. Because somebody comes in who's got 4 years, they want reelected. They don't do anything that doesn't create a return within 4 years that will end up getting them reelected. And so the 30-year industrial development to build high-speed trains or the new kind of fusion energy or whatever it is just doesn't get invested in. And then if you have left versus right, where whatever someone does for 4 years, then the other guy gets in and undoes it for 4 years. And most of the energy goes into campaigning against each other. This system is just dissipating as heat, right? Like it's just burning up as heat. And the system that has no term limits and no internal friction in fighting because they got rid of those people can actually coordinate better. But I would argue it has its own fail states eventually and dystopic properties that are not the thing we want.
So the goal is to create a system that does long-term planning without the negative effects of a monarch or dictator that stays there for the long term, and accomplish that through not through the imposition of a single leader, but through emergence. So doesn't that perhaps, first of all, the technology in itself seems to, maybe you disagree, allow for different possibilities here, which is make primary the system, not the humans. So the basic the medium on which the democracy happens, like a platform where people can make decisions, do the choice making, the coordination of the choice making, where emerges some kind of order to where like something that applies at the scale of the family, the extended family, the city, the country, the continent, the whole world, and then does that so dynamically, constantly changing based on the needs of the people, sort of always evolving. And it would all be owned by Google. Like doesn't this? So looking a little bit into the future, let's first step into the past, sort of the philosophical question about China. If you were to put yourself in the shoes of the Chinese government, if they were to be more transparent, how should they be more transparent? Because like it's easy to say we want to see this, but from a perspective of government, and not just the Chinese government, but a government on whose geographic territory, say it's a lab leak occurred that has resulted in trillions of dollars of loss, countless of lives, just all kinds of damage to the world. If they were to admit or show data that could serve as evidence for a lab leak, that's something that people could, like in the worst case, start wars over.
Yep.
Or in the most likely case, just constantly bring that up at every turn, making you like powerless in negotiations. It's like whenever you want to do something in a geopolitical sense, the United States will bring up, oh, remember that time you cost us trillions of dollars because of your fuck up?
Yeah.
So what is the incentive for the Chinese government to be transparent? And if it is to be transparent, how should it do it? So like, there's a bunch of people, like the reason I'm talking to you, as opposed to a bunch of other folks, because you are kind-hearted and thoughtful and open-minded and really respected. There's a bunch of people that are talking about lab leak that are a little bit less interested in building a better world and more interested in pointing out the emperor has no clothes. They want step one, which is saying like basically tearing down the bullshitters. They don't want to do the further steps of building. And so as a Chinese government, I would be nervous about being transparent with anybody that just wants to tear our power centers, our power structures down. Anyway, that's a long way to ask, like, how should the Chinese government be transparent now and in the future?
So maybe I'll break that down into a few sub-questions. The first is, what should, in an ideal world, what should the Chinese government do? And that's pretty straightforward. They should be totally transparent. The South African government now, there's an outbreak of this Omicron variant, and the South African government has done what we would want a government to do, is say, hey, there's an outbreak. We don't have all of the information. We need help. We want to alert the world. And in some ways, they're being punished for it through these travel bans, but it's a separate topic. But I actually think short-term travel bans actually are not a terrible idea. They should have on day one, if they should have allowed WHO experts in. They should have shared information. They should have allowed a full and comprehensive investigation with international partnerships to understand what went wrong. They should have shared their raw data. They should have allowed their scientists to speak and write publicly, because nobody knows more about this stuff, certainly in the early days, than their scientists do. So it's relatively easy to say what they should do. It's a hard question to say, well, what would happen? Let's just say tomorrow, we prove for certain that this pandemic stems from both from an accidental lab incident and then from what I've consistently called a criminal cover-up, because the cover-up has done in many ways as much or more damage than the incident. Well, what happens? You could easily imagine Xi Jinping has had 2 terms as the leader of China,
and he can now have unlimited terms.
Well, they've changed the rules for that, but he's got a lot of enemies. I mean, there are a lot of people who are waiting in line to step up. So, is there a chance that Xi Jinping could be deposed if it was proven that this comes from a lab? I think there's a real possibility. Would people in the United States Congress, for example, demand reparations from China? So we've had $4.5 trillion of stimulus, all of the economic losses. We owe a lot of money to China from our debt. I'm quite certain that members of Congress would say, we're just going to wipe that out. It would destroy the global financial system, but I think they would be extremely likely. Would other countries like India, that have lost millions of people and had terrible economic damages, would they demand reparations? So I think that from a Chinese perspective, starting from now, it would have major geopolitical implications. And go back to Chernobyl, like, there was a reason why the Soviet Union went to such lengths to cover things up. And when it came out, I mean, there are different theories, but certainly Chernobyl played some role in the end of communist power in the Soviet Union. So the Chinese are very, very aware of that.
But the difference, of course, with Chernobyl, the damage to the rest of the world was not as nearly as significant as with COVID. So you say that the cover-up is a crime, but everything you just described, the response of the rest of the world is, I could say, unfair.
Well, it's not...
If it's if we say the best possible version of the story, lab leaks happen. They shouldn't happen, but they happen. And how is that on the Chinese government?
Yeah.
I mean, what's a good example? I mean,
well, Union Carbide. There was this American company operating in India. They had this leak. All these people were killed. The company admitted responsibility. I was working in the White House when the United States government, in my view, which I know to be the case, but other people in China think differently, bombed the Chinese embassy in Belgrade. And so the United States government allowed a full investigation. Then we paid reparations to the families. And so to your question, if I were, let's just say I were the Chinese government, in kind of an idealized version of the Chinese government, And let's just say that they had come to the conclusion that it was a lab incident. And let's just say they knew that even if they continued to cover it up, eventually this information would come out. I mean, maybe there was a whistleblower, maybe they knew of some evidence that we didn't know about or something. What would I do starting right now? What I would do is I would hold a press conference and I would say, we had this terrible accident. The reason why we were doing this research in Wuhan and elsewhere is that we had SARS-1 and we felt a responsibility to do everything possible to prevent that kind of terrible thing happening again for our country and for the world. That was why we collaborated with France, with the United States in building up those capacities. We know that nothing is perfect, but we're a sovereign country and we have our own system. And so we had to adapt our systems so that they made sense internally. When this outbreak began, we didn't know how it started. And that was why we wanted to look into things. When the process of investigating became so political, it gave us pause. And we were worried that our enemies were trying to use this investigation in order to undermine us. Having said that, now that we've dug deeper, we have recognized, because we have access to additional information that we didn't have then, that this pandemic started from an accidental lab incident. And we feel really terribly about that. And we know that we were very aggressive in covering up information in the beginning. But the reason we were doing that is because we fully believe that it came from a natural origin. Now that we see otherwise, we feel terribly. Therefore, we're doing a few different things. One is we are committing ourselves to establishing a stronger WHO, a new pandemic treaty that addresses the major challenges that we face and allows the World Health Organization to pierce the veil of absolute sovereignty, because we know that when these pandemics happen, they affect everybody. We are also putting, and you can pick your number, but let's start with $5 trillion, some massive amount, into a fund that we will be distributing to the victims of COVID-19 and their
China would do that?
This is a fantasy speech.
But I disagree with okay. So you think China has a responsibility?
So it's not just a lab leak. Like if China on day one had said, we have this outbreak, we don't know where it came from, we want to have a full investigation, we call on responsible international partners to join us in that process. And we're going to do everything in our power to share the relevant information, because however this started, we're all victims. That's a totally different story than punishing Australia, preventing the WHO, blocking any investigation, condemning people who are trying to look. And so
cover up for a couple weeks, you can understand maybe, because there's so much uncertainty. You're like, let's hide all the Winnie the Pooh pictures.
Yeah.
While we figure this out. But the moment you really figure out what happened, you always, as a Jew, I can say this, always find like blame the Jews kind of situation. just a little bit. Be like, all right, it's not us.
Yeah.
I'm just kidding. But be proactive in saying...
Sorry to interrupt, but the joke about that is there's a big problem because a lot of people have to leave the Jewish socialist conspiracy to make it for the Jewish capitalist conspiracy meeting.
I love it. So I would say not 5 trillion, but some large amount. And I would really focus on the future, which is every time we talk about the lab leak, the unfortunate thing is I feel like people don't focus enough about the future. To me, the lab leak is important because we want to construct a kind of framework of thinking and a global conversation that minimizes the damage done by future lab leaks, which will almost certainly happen. And so to me, any lab leak is about the future. I would launch a giant investment in saying we're going to create a testing infrastructure, like all of this kind of infrastructure investments that help minimize the damage of a lab leak here and the rest of the world.
So the challenge with that is, one, it's hard to imagine a fully accountable future system to prevent these kinds of terrible pandemics that's built upon obfuscation and cover-up regarding the origins of this worst pandemic in a century. So it's just like that foundation isn't strong enough. Second, China, across the fields of science, is looking to leapfrog the rest of the world. So China now has current plans to build BSL-4 labs in every of its province.
Yeah, they're scaling up
they're scaling up everything. And so with the plan on leading, and that's why, again, I was saying before, I think there's a lot of similarity between this story, at least as I see it, at least the most probable case, and these other areas where China gets knowledge and then tries to leapfrog. It's the same with AI and autonomous killer robots. It's the same with human genome editing, with animal experimentations, with so many, basically all areas of advanced science. So the question is, would China stop in that process? And then third, it's a little bit of a historical background, but defending national sovereignty is one of the core principles of certainly of the Chinese state. And the historical issue is, for those of us who come from the West, I mean, one of the lessons of the post-war planners was that absolute national sovereignty was actually a major feeder into the First and Second World Wars, that we had all these conflicting states. And therefore, the logic of the post-war system is we need to, in some ways, pool sovereignty. That's like the EU, and have transnational organizations like the UN organizations and the Bretton Woods organizations. For most Asian states, and also even for some African, and the people who were kind of on the colonized side of history, sovereignty was the thing that was denied them. That was the thing that they want, that the European powers denied. And so the idea of giving up sovereignty was the absolute opposite. And so that's why China is, and again, I mentioned this Rush Doshi book. It's not that China is trying to strengthen this rules-based international order, which is based on the principle that, well, there are certain things that we share, and how do we build a governance system to protect those things? What it seems to be doing is trying to advance its own sovereignty. And so I think I agree with you, but I don't think that we can just go forward without some accountability for the past.
So the cover-up was a big problem. It's like I find myself playing devil's advocate because I'm trying to sort of empathize, and then I forget that like 2 or 3 people listen to this thing, and then they're like, "Look, Lex is defending the Chinese government with their cover-up." No, I'm not. I'm just trying to understand. I mean, it's the same reason I'm reading Mein Kampf now. Is like you have to really understand the minds of people, as if I too could have done that. You have to understand that we're all the same to some degree, and that kind of empathy is required to figure out solutions for the future. It's just in empathizing with the Chinese government in this whole situation, I'm still not sure I understand how to minimize the chance of a cover-up in the future, whether for China or for the United States. If the virus started in the United States, I'm not exactly sure we would be, with all the emphasis we put on freedom of speech, with all the emphasis we put on freedom of the press and access to the press, to sort of all aspects of government, I'm not sure the U.S. government wouldn't do a similar kind of cover-up.
Let me put it this way. So we're in Texas now doing this interview. Imagine there's a kind of horseshoe bat that we'll call the Texas horseshoe bat. And the Texas...
There's a lot of bats in Austin, but
it's true.
The whole thing.
It's true. And so let's just say that the Texas horseshoe bats only exist in Texas. But in Montana, we have a thing, it's called the Montana Institute of Virology. And at the Montana Institute of Virology, they have the world's largest collection of Texas horseshoe bats, including horseshoe bats that are associated with a previous global pandemic called the Texas horseshoe bat pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
And let's just say that people in Montana, in the same town where this Montana Institute of Virology is, start getting a version of this Texas horseshoe bat syndrome that is genetically relatively similar to the outbreak in Texas. There are no horseshoe bats there. And the government says, it's your same point, Alina's point about the unicorns, like nothing to see here, just move along. You know, I would...
No, but what's the incentive?
Joe Rogan and Brett Weinstein and Josh Rogan and I mean, would they say, oh, I guess... I mean, I just think that...
No, but the point is the government going to say it. So Joe Rogan is a comedian. Brett Weinstein is a podcaster.
Yeah.
The point is, what we want is not just those folks to have the freedom to speak. That's important. But you want the government to have the transparent, like I don't think Joe Rogan is enough to hold the government accountable. I think they're going to do their thing anyway.
But I think that's our system, and that was the genius of the founding fathers.
Was that enough?
That the government probably is going to have a lot of instincts to do the wrong thing. That was the experience in England before, and so that's why we have free speech, to hold the government accountable. I mean, I'm a kind of broadly a gun control person, but the people who say, well, we need to have broad gun rights.
Mm-hmm. As somebody who's now in Texas, I am offended.
But their argument is, look, we don't fully trust the government. If the government, just like we fought against the British, if the government's wrong, we want to at least have some authority. So that's our system, is to have that kind of voice, and that is the public voice actually balances. Because every government, as you correctly said, every government has the same instincts, and that's why we have, and it's imperfect here, but kind of these ideas of separation of powers, of inalienable rights, so that we can have, it's almost like a vast market where we can have balance.
So you think if a lab leak occurred in the United States, what probability would you put some kind of public report led by Rand Paul would come out saying this was a lab leak? You have good confidence that that would happen? I have pretty
decent confidence. And the reason I say, I mentioned that I think of myself, I'm sure I'm not anymore because as I get older, but as a progressive person, I'm a Democrat, and I worked in Democratic administrations, worked for President Clinton on the National Security Council. But my kind of best friend in the United States Senate, who I talk to all the time, is a senator from Kansas named Roger Marshall. And Roger, I mean, if you just lined up our positions on all sorts of things, we're radically different. But we have a great relationship. We talk all the time, and we share a commitment to saying, well, let's ask the tough questions about how this started. And again, if we had, like, what is the United States government? Yeah, it's the executive branch, but there's also Congress. And Congress, you talk about Rand Paul, and as a former executive branch worker when I was on the National Security Council, and I guess technically when I was at the State Department, all of this stuff, all of this process, it just seems like a pain in the ass. It's like these effers, they're just attacking us. We tried to do this thing we had all the best intentions, and now they're holding hearings and they're trying to box us in and whatever. But that's our process. And there's like a form of accountability, as chaotic, as crazy as it is. And so it makes it really difficult. I mean, we have other problems of just chaos and everybody doing their own thing, but it makes it difficult to have a kind of systematic cover-up. And again, all of that is predicated on my hypothesis, not fully proven, although I think likely, that there is a lab incident origin of this pandemic.
Well, I mean, we're having like several layers of conversation, but I think, what role do you think government, our favorite entity, has in setting policy and rules about this domain, from research to the development to early stage to late stage AI and AGI development?
So I think that first of all, it's really important the government's in there, right? In some way, shape, or form. At the end of the day, we're talking about building technology that will shape how the world operates, and that there needs to be government as part of that answer. And so that's why we've done a number of different congressional testimonies. We interact with a number of different lawmakers, and that right now a lot of our message to them is that it's not the time for regulation; it is the time for measurement. Right? That our main policy recommendation is that people, and the government does this all the time with bodies like NIST, spend time trying to figure out just where the technology is, how fast it's moving, and can really become literate and up to speed with respect to what to expect. So I think that today the answer really is about measurement, and I think that there will be a time and place where that will change. And I think it's a little bit hard to predict exactly what exactly that trajectory should look like.
So there will be a point at which regulation, federal in the United States, the government steps in and helps be the, I don't want to say the adult in the room, to make sure that there is strict rules, maybe conservative rules that nobody can cross.
Well, I think there's kind of maybe two angles to it. So today with narrow AI applications, that I think there are already existing bodies that are responsible and should be responsible for regulation. You think about, for example, with self-driving cars, that you want the the National Highway
NHTSA,
yeah, exactly, to be regulating that. That makes sense, right? That basically what we're saying is that we're going to have these technological systems that are going to be performing applications that humans already do. Great, we already have ways of thinking about standards and safety for those. So I think actually empowering those regulators today is also pretty important. And then I think for AGI, that there's going to be a point where we'll have better answers. And I think that maybe a similar approach of first measurement and, start thinking about what the rules should be. I think it's really important that we don't prematurely squash progress. Like I think it's very easy to kind of smother a budding field. And I think that's something to really avoid. But I don't think that the right way of doing it is to say, let's just try to blaze ahead and not involve all these other stakeholders.
So, talk to Ian Goodfellow, but the thing is, the initial GAN produced pretty terrible results. Right. So only because it was in a very specific, only because they're smart enough to know that this is quite surprising. It can generate anything that they know. I mean, do you see a world, or is that too optimistic and dreamer-like to imagine that the compute resources are something that's owned by governments and provided as utility?
Actually, to some extent, this question reminds me of a blog post from one of my former professors at Harvard, this guy, Matt Welsh, who was a systems professor. I remember sitting in his tenure talk, right? And, that he had literally just gotten tenure. He went to Google for the summer, and then decided he wasn't going back to academia, right? And that kind of in his blog post, he makes this point that, look, as a systems researcher, that I come up with these cool system ideas, right? And I kind of build a little proof of concept. And the best thing I can hope for is that the people at Google or Yahoo, which was around at the time, will implement it and actually make it work at scale, right? That's like the dream for me, right? I build the little thing and they turn it into the big thing that's actually working. And for him, he said, I'm done with that. I want to be the person who's actually building and deploying. And I think that there's a similar dichotomy here, right? I think that there are people who really actually find value. And I think it is a valuable thing to do, to be the person who produces those ideas, right? Who builds the proof of concept. And yeah, you don't get to generate the coolest possible GAN images, but you invented the GAN, right? And so that there's a real trade-off there. And I think that that's a very personal choice, but I think there's value in both sides.
Let me ask a little bit an out there question. Maybe it's a speculation, but maybe touching on Roswell. Do you think it's possible that there is out of this world aircraft or beings that are in the possession of one of the governments on this earth, like the U.S. government? Is it possible? So the one perspective of that, if it's possible, is it possible to keep a secret like that?
I would say this. I think it's highly possible.
Because if you just look at all the sightings, and just look at Project Blue Book. There was I forget how many thousands of sightings. And there's a percentage, it's like 10 or 15% of them they still can't explain. Like our Tic Tac is one of them. They basically, the government has come out and said, we don't know what that was. Okay. So if you go, okay, of that 15% that we don't know, and of these thousands, there's still that 15% makes up a pretty big number. What are the chances that not one of them crashed somewhere on the globe and was recovered? And I don't care if it's an intact system or you got pieces of it of a metal that we can't explain, or some biological matter, to say the least. It could be intact or it couldn't, but the odds of that now are starting to go down, that that could never happen. And I'm not talking just the United States, I'm talking the world.
Globally.
So is there a chance that a foreign government actually possesses, or our government, or someone in the world, on the globe, of the 7+ billion people, has something that is not from this world? And I'm not talking a meteor, but something that was manufactured in some way that allowed transport or observation. Could be a drone, could be a foreign drone, like Voyager flies around and does all that stuff. And we got stuff that just went past Pluto that's out in the Kuiper Belt. There's stuff out there floating around. And what about ours? It's going to crash into Jupiter eventually, or whatever, because we've had stuff crash into planets. So if that's the case, you would think something is out there, that we have something that we can't explain. And according to Lou, there is stuff that we can't explain. And I would assume that Lou, who ran ATIP, has seen stuff that he can't openly talk about, because I had a clearance. Mm-hmm. When you have a clearance, you sign your name, you're bound to that. And to me, that's an important oath that you hold to. And this is kind of where people have issues with Bob. So if and I leave it to you to determine if you believe Bob or not. I'll tell you, Bob is a straightforward, very sane, normal, super smart guy.
Bob Lazar, yeah.
Yes. There is the other side that says, well, should he have come out and talked? To those who hold clearance, who, are true to the government, you would say he should have never spoke. He was under an oath to not say anything, but he did. If you ask Bob, why did you say something? His answer was, I understand there's an oath, but I felt that the technology could benefit all of mankind and it shouldn't be locked away. And I'll leave it. If you believe Bob, that's kind of what Bob says.
And that's such an interesting key point. If there is aircraft, a technology that's in the possession of the U.S. government, should they make that publicly known? This is the Snowden question. This is the question of, do we release stuff that can potentially change the nature of human civilization? Like the way we think about our place in the world. Also, if that technology is potentially useful for military applications, the nature of military conflict, should we release that information or not, if you were the government?
So here's exactly how. So for classified information, the government is the people that classify it. So I can't look at something and go, oh my God, this Avion bottle is now top secret. I don't have the authority, the ability, or anyone to do that. That's up to the government. And I agree with that because I worked for the government for 24 years of my life. So I understand that. But now you go, there's reasons stuff is classified, okay? And it has to do with sometimes information is classified by how it was obtained. It's just like the mob. If I have a spy and I'm a mobster and you're the counter mobster, but I have a guy on the inside that's feeding me information, I can't do it. And a perfect example is if you've ever seen it's the Tom Cruise movie, what is it, Air America or whatever, but he plays the guy in Louisiana who was hauling drugs for Pablo Escobar. And he ended up getting a cargo plane, and the government, the CIA, was kind of funding him to do stuff. That's how he got hooked up with Pablo, but they put cameras on his airplane. And when Reagan had come out and said, here's pictures, we have proof that they're running these drugs, it didn't take Pablo long to figure out those pictures were taken from inside of the plane of this guy he had been working with, and that guy ends up dead. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So you classify to protect the source. You classify to protect the technology, because if the technology would get out, it could be grave damage, or there's levels depending on if it's a secret or top secret. There are levels of damage that could be done to the U.S. government and our well-being as a country. And we owe it to this because we're all Americans. To me, no matter what some people will say, even in this country, this is the greatest country on the planet. Yeah. This is the only country that you have the ability to do what you want to do. It's just don't be lazy. And I have stories of people that came over here and started with nothing, and they're living the American dream. And they'll tell you, and they didn't get it because of, like you came over here from Russia, you get no minority status or anything else. You're a white Anglo-Saxon, Protestant, whatever your religion, Jew, but you come over here. I kind of knew that from the last one, but you come over here, you basically have made yourself. Yeah. You're educated. You're working at literally the top research university in the world, to be honest.
I can do whatever the hell I can create with a lot of hard work. I can do quite
and no one gave it to you.
No.
So, I mean, and had people.
I'm a believer that we are a community. So like there is a social aspect to it, but the freedom and the American dream is a real thing. And I joke about being Russian, but I'm an American, and this is, I do believe, the greatest country on earth. So there's a reason the nationalist pride, the pride in your nation is a powerful thing. And around that, this secrecy holds value. But to me, alien technology is bigger than that. I mean, it's not so much a threat as you're holding back something that could inspire the world, human knowledge.
So let's talk in theory. So I'm going to go back to Bob, because I've talked to Bob. So Bob is a propulsion guy. Right. Bob has a bicycle with a rocket motor. He built the rocket car, so he did that. So if you are trying to figure out a propulsion system, let's just say this is Dave's theory. Yeah. I have custody of this thing from a technology that I don't understand. And I know it's a propulsion system. So now I got to figure it out. Right. So who are you going to go to? Right. You go find someone. So you go, wait, here's a guy who at the time was working at Los Alamos, which they have proven, who is big into propulsion. He designs all this. He builds his shit in his garage. Hey, he's super smart. Why don't we bring him in? So you hire him on a contract and you go, hey, we're going to brief you into a program, and he goes and works on wherever he says he worked. That's not important, but you get access to the technology to try and figure it out. And then you go, well, Bob comes out and says, we're figuring out these things, but there's a part where our technology isn't advanced enough for us to figure the whole thing out. So then, and let's just say Bob doesn't come out and tell anyone. He works on it until he gets to the point where he's stagnated. He's at a wall. You go, I can't do it. So sometimes the best thing is to bring in a fresh mind. So you go find someone else who's into propulsion, you bring him in, they work, they can't figure it out, or they get to the point where, kind of back to the Einstein theory, where, hey, I've got all these theories on how it works, but we don't have the technology. We haven't advanced enough to actually do what we need to do. We still have to advance technology more. So then what do? You shelve it. You go, hey, good, project's over, end the contract. You shelf it, and you wait another 10 years. And you wait another 10 years until technology and our abilities and our research advances more. And then you go find new people to bring in that are experts in that field and go, hey, we want you to work on this thing. And here's what we know about it so far. Yeah. Or you don't tell them anything, because remember, if you reveal someone else's research, you can taint their beliefs. They'll start to sway in that direction. So you go, I'm not going to tell you anything. I'm going to give you this thing, and now you tell me what you think. And as they progress, if they get stuck on a problem that maybe Bob and someone else solved earlier, you can go, hey, what about this? You don't have to tell them where it came from. What about this? And now they can leapfrog, and they get another 2 steps closer to the final answer. And then we get stuck by our evolution of technology, and you shelve it again.
Do you think that's the right way to do it? Because it's heartbreaking. I love government, but we just had this discussion about Elon and so on. The alternative approach is to release this to the world and say there's a mystery here. And then the Elons of the world, the Jeff Bezos, we talked about money, but it's also not just money. It's like this engine that's within, we talked about the American dream, to say, I'm going to be the one that cracks this mystery open. And like, that's within a lot of us. And like, money aside, people in their garage just will.
But you're thinking like a scientist. So now let's shift to, let me think like a country. So we have country A, B, and C. And you can look at the nuclear arms race. So we know that Germany was really close. We know that Russia was getting pretty close. Yeah. We just won the race, and we were the first ones with it. Yeah. And still to this day,
Germany could have won.
They could have won. They could have won, but someone was smart enough to not finish the equation when they knew they had the answer. It is literally what it comes down to. Someone was smart enough to realize if that got into the hands of the Nazis, that would be the end. And that's a tough call to do that, knowing that you have the answer and you can't solve the problem because it will go into the wrong hand. And that's kind of the fear when you look at this. You go, okay, so if we do this, if we put it out there, we've got this technology. If we don't work on it kind of international space station, like where we're all going to work on it together in a, like Antarctica is really supposed to be treaty free from any weapons or anything. We're supposed to, we got the international thing down there. We're all going to work together. If you did it in the confines of that and you could control the flow in and out, because what you don't want is someone stealing information and getting it back to where, and countries are notorious to do this. Hey, we're doing it internationally, but we're secretly doing it ourselves to see who can come up with a solution first. That's the problem, because we have this inherent thing of power, and technology like that is power. It would literally change the game of the way the world operates, and from not just a transportation or mankind, but from a military aspect, it's got huge.
Yeah. So beautifully presented, and I feel like there's a tension between those two places: the scientist view of the world and the national security view of the world. Let me get to this kind of interesting point, which is a lot of conspiracy theorists kind of paint a picture of government as a hierarchical system that's exceptionally competent and good at hiding secrets. And then, I tend to not subscribe to almost any conspiracy theory, to the degree at least that the conspiracy theorists do.
I agree with you.
But there does seem to be, and I tend to think of government as unfortunately incompetent, at least the bureaucracy. It seems that the communication, like the 3 videos that were released, and just the way DOD in general talks about the things we've been talking about, it's just confused. It's contradictory. It's not inspiring. It's suspicious. It's just not, even the way they release the videos. The Tic Tac, if presented correctly, could just inspire a generation of scientists. It's like us going to the moon. It's inspiring. It's incredible. Yep. And the way it was released was suspicious. It was like low resolution video on a crappy website, like with some crappy documents. And why? I don't know how to ask this question, but can government do better? Why are they doing it this way in terms of communicating the things they do know to the public?
Because I don't think they know how. Especially in this topic, it's been hidden for so many years. And I don't think, because I don't buy off on the conspiracy stuff. I just think that, when it comes in, like I said, the government has a right to classify stuff. They classify everything because they don't know. You have something, you don't know what it is, you don't know. So we just go, well, it must be top secret, and let's put it in a vault. It's kind of like the Indiana Jones, where they take the Ark and they put it it's in the giant army warehouse. We don't even know what we have. So, but I also believe that, and I'll say this openly, I don't think that the American people need to know everything. I think there's a reason that stuff is classified for the protection of this country. And I totally believe in that. So, I was joking with Joe when he was talking about the Storm Area 51 stuff. I'm like, that's probably the worst idea you could possibly have, is to just storm a military installation. It's just stupid. Yeah. There are reasons that we have things that we don't just let out to the public, because if we do, as soon as you do let someone know that you have something, they immediately try to counter it. And perfect example. The U.S. in the 60s developed a bomber. It was a Mach 3 compression lift bomber called the XB-70. Okay, there was 3 of them built. 3 of them ever built. It was a 60,000 foot high, Mach 3. It was an incredible airplane when you see it. And there's actually the last one remaining is in Dayton, Ohio at the museum. It would go, the wingtips would fold down. It looks like a Concorde, but it's way faster. When that got out that we were developing it, the Soviet Union developed the MiG-25, literally a high altitude interceptor to counter that bomber. And they built an entire fleet of MiG-25s, right? We built 3 XB-70s and we scrapped the program, right? Because now you go, well, the technology is cool. We proved it, but now it becomes obsolete. So it's not even worth building a whole fleet of these things. It's constant. It's a chess game. We do something, they do something. We do something, they do something, and we do something, and then they counter it. You got to figure out how to defeat it. So you go, oh, we'll build something. So the more we keep quiet, especially from a defense standpoint, the better. Personally, I think we talk too much, and I think the military and the DoD is starting to see that, we're too open. You announce, hey, we're building this because there's a budget line and we live in a free society. But you don't have to release all the specs, and you don't have to put everything in open source. But that's a problem when we go to universities. If you want to go do work with MIT and you want to partner with MIT and you're a defense company and you want to partner, you guys have a rule that if you create it, then it can be open source because the university owns it and we are an institution of learning.
Yep.
Where the defense side might go, we don't really want that published in a paper in Scientific America or
it's
IEEE.
so heartbreaking. I talked to CTO of Lockheed, Keiko Jackson, and just Skunkworks. Some of the best, if not the best, engineering and science, but engineering really ever is done in secrecy, and it sucks because it's so inspiring, and they can't talk about it.
It is, but some of it's due to funding. The U.S. government has deep pockets. Some of this new technology that you develop for an open source, unless, and goes back to the original conversation, there's enough money in the private sector that individuals control. Yeah. Bezos, I'm not talking Amazon, I'm talking Jeff Bezos,
a single individual,
is worth over $100 billion. He has the ability to do stuff. I'll tell you what, the Gates Foundation, between Bill Gates and his wife, and Warren Buffett and some of the other money, because I think Bezos' ex-wife actually donated a huge chunk of her half into the Gates Foundation. Yeah. So, what's the Gates Foundation worth these days? And these are guys, brilliant. Some of the greatest minds that we have to go, what are they doing? Because they have the ability it's a nonprofit. They can go, hey, I want to fund this. I want to fund this research.
They can look beyond the conflict between nations.
You can look beyond the conflict of having to have, classification. You can do what you want. It's just like, we classify how to do, the whole nuclear, how to create a critical mass, right? But there's really smart high school kids that have figured it out mathematically, and they do their science project, and then the government comes in and says, hey, we got to classify your government because we just don't want this out in the public domain, which I understand, but they never stop them from free thought and developing that. It's just, hey, we really don't want this out there. Okay, so I understand that. I totally understand that. But if they, if Bill and Melinda want to do this and go, hey, we want to do this, and they're going to work with Bezos and they're going to work with Elon, and we're going to, you think about it. There's a significant amount of money that could be available to R&D. And I'm not talking just science like this. I'm talking medical research and all this. But then you go, well, who gets it? Because now you're competing against the companies that actually do it. And you go, are they the greatest minds? I'd say, we have a tendency to go, these are the best that we have. And I'd say, well, no, that's the best that we know we have. But there's probably people out there that don't want to work. There's brilliant minds that don't want to do anything with defense because they just disagree with what it does. So they go to another path. They go do something else.
And in a sense, like the Elons of the world, the Jeff Bezos, are actually, in a certain sense, much better than DoD at finding the brilliant, weird minds out there.
Because they're not tied to the government. So when you work a government contract, the government writes, they tell you what they want, and then they work with you on the requirements. And they usually have an end in mean. They have an idea that this is what I want it to be. Where if you go to like SpaceX, where, they come up with, why don't we just land these things on a pad and reuse them?
Yeah.
Well, if the government scientist, if you're on a government contract, says, no, that's not the requirements, we're not paying for that, we want you to do this, you're kind of controlled. Or when Elon does it, his company, they can do whatever the hell they want to do because they have no bounds. The only bounds they have is the liability if it doesn't work and it lands on something. So what do? You go out to Kwajalein and you test it. And if it crashes and it lands in the ocean, hey, we clean it up, no big deal. We lost some money, but we'll move on. It's, money makes the world go round, contrary to what everyone thinks. But, there's a lot of money that's sitting around that you can do a lot of really cool stuff with. And I don't know. I'll guarantee that, what is it? Blue Origin? Isn't that Blue Amazon?
Origin, yeah.
That they're doing some cool stuff because they have funny. And I joke with the guy I know that worked at SpaceX, and he was funny because they were building the first test thing, and they were limited, and Elon found this like 400-acre thing. I think it's about 400 acres down by Waco, Texas. And he's like, I go, how? He goes, dude, I worked with, because he's done government contract. He goes, there's government contract, and then there's working at SpaceX with Elon money. And that's what he refers to it as, is Elon money, where it was like, I'll throw them, and he would throw the money at it and make it happen. And I'm talking this fast.
Yeah.
I mean, he has a great story about this. I mean, this is Elon. This is how fast you can do in the private sector vice the government, where there's the bureaucracy is. They had a company that was basically a tool and die machine shop that did a lot of their high precision parts for the rockets. Mm-hmm. They had went to the guy, but he had contracts with other companies. And when the economy was down, the guy was actually looking at going out of business. So the guy I know, he's telling me the story. He was talking to the guy. He had to go over there and get something. And he's like, holy shit. He goes, hang on. So he calls up on the phone, SpaceX. He says, hey, is Elon there? Can you get him in the boardroom? We'll be there in 20 minutes. So he grabs this guy who's literally going to fold his company. They go over to SpaceX, and I may be getting some of this wrong if people are going to fact check me, but this is pretty close. They go in the boardroom, and he said literally within like an hour or two, Elon has bought the guy's company. That guy is now a senior VP running his company, and they're going to pull all the stuff into the SpaceX thing so they can actually build the parts, and they can still contract out to make the money outside. And it happened like that fast.
And it's not just money. It's because I witnessed it too with Elon. I think it's whatever the forces of capitalism that allow a person like Elon Musk to rise to the top. But like, because I've also worked for DARPA, like for research in terms of a source of funding. There's a weight of bureaucracy when I was working, like being funded by DARPA, and with Elon, like I was literally in the presence of like anything is possible, cutting across all the bullshit of paperwork, of the way things were done in the past, of the bureaucracy, the rules, the constraints, all of that stuff. Just you can cut across immediately.
So how much money and time do you waste dealing with the bureaucracy when you could actually be doing real work? That's the difference. This is why I honestly, when I went back to the industrial defense complex that we were warned about, when you look at it and go, SpaceX can do something for half the price ahead of schedule that what we're paying Boeing. And you go, oh, well, this just came out. And you go, well, then why are we even dealing with this side when we can deal with this side?
Yeah.
Because you've got a fully automated capsule that has a manual mode that they got to fly around in. It worked like a champ. It went up, it hung out, it came back, it splashed down. It worked perfectly. We're going to dust it off. And oh, by the way, unlike the Apollo capsules that were used and then put to museums, they're going to reuse that Dragon capsule. It came down, they're going to dust it off, put a new coat of paint on it, slap it on top of another rocket, and away it goes. Holy cow.
It's amazing.
It's a shift. It's a complete shift in mentality. And for us as taxpayers, we can explore at half the cost.
Yeah. It's exciting, especially given putting the Tic Tac in context, like then the sky, it's limitless, the possibilities we could do with this kind of mechanism.
I think it's exciting.
Yeah,
I think we live in an exciting time right now, besides everything that's messed up in the world right now.
Well, this is a hopeful, like there's so much conflict going on, so much tension. That's to me, space exploration at the moment is a reason to get up in the morning and have a hope for the future, to look up to the sky. And we're humans. We can we can solve all of this.
I was talking about when I was doing the Tucker thing, and I said, this would be great, because when the government had come out, a month ago and said, hey, this does exist, we're doing this, and we're going to release more stuff. Mm-hmm. And I was texting like Lou and Chris Mellon and those guys before I went on, because they had called me up to be on Tucker's show, and I'm like, hey, I go, this would be great. Just come out with this, find the relic of a spaceship, like pull out the Roswell wreckage if you have it. Pull out the Roswell wreckage and do it. God, it would be so nice to not have to deal with the riots in the cities. And I mean, I know it's an election year and all that, but God, it would be refreshing to not have to turn on my TV and see everything that is just depressing in the world. To be, holy cow, we actually do have this, and we're working on this technology.
Yeah, imagine if there is a Roswell aircraft and they pull it out. Imagine the innovation that happens in the next 10 to 20 years. Without any more information than that. Just the innovation that happens, the look on Elon Musk's face, the look on Jeff Bezos' face, and all the brilliant engineers.
It would change the game.
It would change the game.
It would change the game.
Great. So let me ask you sort of, sorry, to pull back to the the idea of governments and decentralized currency, there's a tension between decentralization of currency and the power of nations, the power of governments. What's your sense about that tension? Is there some rule for regulation of currency? Is there, like, is government the enemy of digital currency, of distributed currency, or can they be like cautious friends?
I mean, I think like the one thing that people forget is that it's clearly not entirely an enemy, because I think if there hadn't been so much government regulation on kind of centralized issuing centralized digital currencies, then we'd be seeing things, people like Google and Facebook and Twitter just kind of issuing them left and right. And then, like, if that was the case, then decentralized currencies would still appeal to some people, but they definitely would appeal to less people than today. So even in that sense, I think it's clearly been kind of more of a just kind of set the stage for the kind of the existence as of the sector in some ways, but also, and I think some of both. Like, there's definitely things that governments kind of can do, in some cases have done, to hurt the spread of and of growth of blockchains. There's things that they've done to help, and they've in some cases definitely done a good job of kind of going after fraudulent projects, and of going after some of the projects that have some of the kind of craziest and most misleading marketing. There's also the possibility that governments will end up using blockchains for a lot of different things. Like, governments, they do a lot more than just regulating, right? Like, there's also, like, they have the kind of identity records, and they have kind of like property registries, even just their own currency is like secure, like lots of different kind of things that they're operating, and there's even blockchain applications in a lot of those.
Yeah, and they can leverage technology to do a lot of good for our societies. It is a little unfortunate that governments often lag behind in terms of their acceptance and leverage of technology. If you look at the autonomous vehicle space, AI in general, they're a few years behind, and it'd be nice to help them catch up. That's always ongoing. Let me ask sort of a critical question of, if you're wrong about your statements about Bitcoin, you find out years from now that you were wrong, what would that look like? What would be the things that make you realize you were wrong? Likely ideas or crazy out there ideas? Do you think about this kind of stuff?
All the time.
Because you speak very confidently about Bitcoin. And one of the things, let me put it this way, I think certainty, I feel like that's like a Stoic statement. Certainty leads to ruin, something like that. Like, certainty, I think, is an antithesis to progress often. And especially in your writing, but this is true for the Bitcoin community, there's a certainty about the Bitcoin. And that makes me very skeptical, no matter how good the ideas are. Whenever things are good, this might be the Russian in me, I think, like, what are the ways this is going to go wrong? So what do you think are the ways this might go wrong, or you're wrong in your conception of what Bitcoin is?
Yeah, so science evolves via negativa, meaning that we're not proving hypotheses, and that's what becomes the body of science. Science is whatever is left over as we disprove hypotheses, right? Whatever we can empirically, through experimentation, disprove gets discarded, and whatever remains, whatever theory remains that hasn't been disproven, is science, effectively. This process is similar to market actors zeroing in on a store value, right? They're experimenting with different forms of storing wealth across time. Some do better than others, and eventually everyone ends up on the one that is best. That's what gold was. In terms of understanding Bitcoin, I look at it as a similar approach. And that is the main question I'm asking myself is, how do you stop this thing? How do you turn it off? How do you end it? If you're a nation state, particularly, who has the most to lose in this transition, what is the attack vector by which they neutralize Bitcoin? I mean, that is the $250 trillion question. Mm-hmm. And, I've spent 5 years thinking about this thing very deeply. I've read everything on monetary history I can get my hands on. The general thought of how it is stopped, and this is the snag point that a lot of people get to in their explorations down the rabbit hole, is they just say the government will never allow it. And that becomes kind of their bottom. It's like, all right, Bitcoin's interesting, it's superior money, blah, 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 but the government will never allow it. And they say,
was Ray Dalio, did he say that?
Dalio was currently stuck there, yeah.
So Ray Dalio said that Bitcoin seems to be too promising.
Yeah.
If it is in fact as promising as it looks, governments are going to, I don't forget what the exact quote is, but not allow it. Ban it.
Yeah.
Governments will ban it. So how do you get Ray Dalio unstuck from your perspective?
Well,
and how do you get unstuck from that idea that how do you prevent governments from stopping a thing that threatens centralized power?
Well, Bitcoin is an idea. So governments that are really good at fighting centralized threats to their power, right? Whether that's a currency counterfeiter or a competing nation state or a business they don't like or an individual they don't like, they can kill them, they can throw them in jail, they can use any number of coercive or violent tactics to suppress it. But how do you point a gun at an idea? How do you coerce an idea? And that's, there is some anecdotal history here where there's the PGP case, which in the United States, the court was trying to classify it as munitions when we were shipping this pretty good privacy software overseas. Government wanted to classify it as munitions and restrict that exportation. And this was a circuit court case precedent when the PGP attorneys actually printed out the source code on paper and presented it as evidence in the court. All of a sudden it became protected under freedom of speech, and that it's just code is speech, code is language, and therefore, at least in the United States, it's protected under the First Amendment. I think a government ban would be largely unenforceable, frankly, on Bitcoin. Being that it's pure information, if you suppress market actors from using it in one jurisdiction, you're just creating incentives for them to go elsewhere. And you're actually increasing the incentives for other jurisdictions to be favorable towards it, because then they get to benefit from the tax revenue and the businesses and the innovation that's occurring in and around Bitcoin as a result.
So you don't think if a particular central bank, like in Europe or United States, bans it, not maybe using those terms, but in some kind of way, you think that provides a really strong incentive for the other big players to enable it?
That's right. And that they're more likely, by the way, and governments know this, by the way, too. The other thing that causes the government to shoot itself in the foot is that if they ban something, they draw a lot of attention to it.
Yeah.
People are smart. I mean, people ask why. Why would a government ban it? Why can't I use this? So that's kind of typically be the last arrow in their quiver. They may try to ban it if Bitcoin, really starts to monetize very quickly, and the power structures that they impose today start to dissolve faster than others might think they will. Then they might try and ban it, but I think that ban will be largely unenforceable. They're more likely to tax it, which they already do tax it. They're likely to increase taxation of it. They're likely to try and make it more white market by actually tracing Bitcoin, seeing who has it, attaching identities to Bitcoin ownership, and making sure that they're getting their pound of flesh on all the transactions it results in. But I don't think the other thing about this is, so we saw the internet outcompete intranets. In that we could say that open source networks tend to outcompete closed source networks. And there's a really good reason for this. And it's because in a closed source network, there are costs associated with defending the network itself. So you have to, the network owners, the owners of the closed source network, have to expend resources protecting it from competitors, and they have to expend resources imposing its rules, because they're not voluntarily adopted rules. So you actually have to impose these rule sets. Whereas an open source network, which is something much more akin to capitalism, pure in its pure sense, these are voluntarily adopted rules. So all market participants have agreed and consented to this rule set. So there's no enforcement cost and there's no turf protection because anyone can freely enter or exit the open network. For that energetic reason, I think open networks outcompete closed networks typically. And in the digital age, that's why I think that's why internet outcompetes intranet, and that's why open source networks are going to eat closed source networks. So what Bitcoin would be in that lens is the ultimate open source monetary network devouring closed source central bank monetary networks. And I just don't see how there's no possibility of unilaterally stopping Bitcoin or destroying it. So then they're more likely to regulate or tax it. And again, the other fallacy here is that a lot of people tend to think of governments as these singular, indivisible entities, like they just move under one plan. But in reality, it's a lot of people, right? A lot of people with loosely coupled interests and agendas and whatnot. Regulators and others, wearing their citizen hat, they're going to see this thing monetizing. They're going to be on the front lines of trying to regulate it, trying to control it. And I think what's likely to happen is they're going to start to adopt it, to buy some of it, even as an individual, or possibly even ultimately as at a central bank or sovereign wealth fund level, as an insurance policy against its success. And once you start to acquire something and then you have a vested economic interest in its monetization, I think it kind of dissolves any of the power structures that are arrayed against it from the inside. Mm-hmm. So I've written a lot about this in a new series called Sovereignism, which is based loosely on a book called The Sovereign Individual. And that's the general thesis, is that microprocessing technology would devour our organizational models, the most important of which is the nation state. So I think we're going into this world where coercion and violence is just much less rewarding. The economics of violence are declining because of the low cost of protecting property, right? You can now protect your monetary property in Bitcoin at orders of magnitude less cost than is necessary to run a banking network. So it changes the way we organize ourselves. And again, if we zooming back to gold as kind of the original governor to governments, where if they manipulated the money, gold would leave their country. Mm-hmm. That's why governments have taken relatively concerted action to go off of the gold standard. There's a great book on this called The Gold Wars that outlines how governments have been waging a cold war against gold for the past 50 years. Bitcoin sort of renews hope for that free market governor of governments, and that is this digital gold that governments cannot stop or co-opt. So I think it's something, that's why I think it's such a big deal, is that it is changing. It's a new useful fiction, you might say, a useful fiction that's superordinate to the mythology of the nation state and government as the dominant institution in the world.
Well, I hope you're right that all forms of centralized power start breaking apart naturally. So governments, the more and more power is given to the individual, whatever the technology is. And Bitcoin seems to be a promising technology that empowers that, enables that. Mm-hmm. That seems to be the trend. And that's a promising trend from at least from a perspective of somebody who values this particular biological meat bag that's full of consciousness.
I think Bitcoin is exposing the greatest scam in human history, which is political authority. Like, who gives anyone the right to be politically have political authority over anyone else. People should be free to adopt the rules and systems and tools that best suit their needs. And that arc of history we covered earlier, where as socioeconomic systems have become more favorable towards individual sovereignty, the more wealthy we have become. The more we have given the individual, we've maximized individual choice, the more wealth that society has created, and the more it has outcompeted the systems that have come before it. The latest would be, capitalism triumphing over socialism.
I was pondering why actually even we have negative impact on the globe. Because, if you ask every single individual, they would like to have clean air, they would like healthy planet, but somehow it's not the case that as a collective we are not going in this direction. I think that there exists very powerful system to describe what we value. That's capitalism. It assigns actually monetary values to various activities. At the moment, the problem in the current system is that there are some things which we value. There is no cost assigned to it. So even though we value clean air, or maybe we also value lack of distraction on, let's say, internet or so, at the moment, these quantities, companies, corporations can pollute them for free. So in some sense, I wished, or that's, I guess, purpose of politics, to align the incentive systems. And we are kind of maybe even moving in this direction. The first issue is even to be able to measure the things that we value. Then we can actually assign the monetary value to them.
Yeah, and it's getting the data, and also probably through technology, enabling people to vote and to move money around in a way that is aligned with their values. And that's very much a technology question. So like having one president and Congress and voting that happens every 4 years or something like that, that's a very outdated idea. There could be some technological improvements to that kind of idea.
So I'm thinking from time to time about these topics, but it also feels to me that it's a little bit like it's hard for me to actually make correct predictions. What is the appropriate thing to do? I extremely trust Sam Altman, our CEO, on these topics. I'm more on the side of being, I guess, naive hippie. That yeah,
that's your life philosophy. Well, I think self-doubt and I think hippie implies optimism. Those two things are pretty good way to operate.
I mean, still it is hard for me to actually understand how the politics works, or how this exactly how the things would play out. And Sam is really excellent with
it. Let me ask a slightly philosophical, fun question. Gotta ask. I know you're focused on getting to Mars, but once we're there on Mars, what form of government, economic system, political system do you think would work best for an early civilization of humans? The interesting reason to talk about this stuff, it also helps people dream about the future. I know you're really focused about the short-term engineering dream, but it's like, I don't know, there's something about imagining an actual civilization on Mars that gives people, really gives people hope.
Well, it would be a new frontier and an opportunity to rethink the whole nature of government, just as was done in the creation of the United States. So, I would suggest having direct democracy, like people vote directly on things, as opposed to representative democracy. So, representative democracy, I think, is too subject to special interests and, a coercion of the politicians and that kind of thing. So I'd recommend that there's just direct democracy. People vote on laws, the population votes on laws themselves, and then the laws must be short enough that people can understand them.
Yeah, and then keeping a well-informed populace, really being transparent about all the information about what they're voting for.
Absolute transparency.
Yeah. And not make it as annoying as those cookies. We have to accept the
cookies. There's always a slight amount of trepidation when you click accept cookies, like I feel as though there's like perhaps like a very tiny chance that it'll open a portal to hell or something like that.
That's exactly how I feel.
Why do they keep wanting me to accept it? What do they want with this cookie? Like somebody got upset with accepting cookies or something somewhere. I mean, who cares? Like, it's so annoying to keep accepting all these cookies.
To me, this is just a
I'm
great.
trying to accept, yes, you can have my damn cookie. I don't care. Whatever.
You heard it from Elon first. He accepts all of your damn cookies.
Yeah. And stop asking me. It's annoying.
Yeah, it's one example of implementation of a good idea done really horribly.
Yeah, it's somebody was like, there's some good intentions of like privacy or whatever, but now everyone just has to click accept cookies, and it's now, you have billions of people who have to keep clicking accept cookie. It's super annoying. Then we just accept the damn cookie. It's fine. There is like, I think a fundamental problem that because we've not really had a major, like a world war or something like that in a while, and obviously we'd like to not have world wars. There's not been a cleansing function for rules and regulations. So wars did have, some silver lining in that there would be a reset on rules and regulations after a war. So World Wars I and II, there were huge resets on rules and regulations. Now, if the society does not have a war and there's no cleansing function or garbage collection for rules and regulations, then rules and regulations will accumulate every year because they're immortal. There's no actual humans die, but the laws don't. So we need a garbage collection function for rules and regulations. They should not just be immortal, because some of the rules and regulations that are put in place will be counterproductive. Done with good intentions, but counterproductive. Sometimes not done with good intentions. So if rules and regulations just accumulate every year, and you get more and more of them, then eventually you won't be able to do anything. You're just like Gulliver with, tied down by thousands of little strings. And we see that in, U.S. and like basically all economies that have been around for a while, and regulators and legislators create new rules and regulations every year, but they don't put effort into removing them. And I think that's very important that we put effort into removing rules and regulations. But it gets tough because you get special interests that then are dependent on, like they have a vested interest in that whatever rule and regulation, and that they fight to not get it removed.
Yeah, so I guess the problem with the Constitution is it's kind of like C versus Java because it doesn't have any garbage collection built in. I think there should be. When you first said the metaphor of garbage collection, I loved
from
it.
a coding standpoint.
From the coding standpoint, yeah. It would be interesting if the laws themselves kind of had a built-in thing where they kind of die after a while unless somebody explicitly publicly defends them.
Yeah.
So that's sort of, it's not like somebody has to kill them, they kind of die themselves. They disappear.
Yeah.
Not to defend Java or anything, but the C++, you could also have great garbage collection in Python and so on.
Yeah. So yeah, something needs to happen, or just the civilization's arteries just harden over time. And you can just get less and less done because there's just a rule against everything. So I think, like, I don't know, for Mars or whatever, I'd say, or even for, obviously for Earth as well, like, I think there should be an active process for removing rules and regulations and questioning their existence. Just, like, if we've got a function for creating rules and regulations, because rules and regulations you can also think of as like, they're like software or lines of code for operating civilization. That's the rules and regulations. So it's not like we shouldn't have rules and regulations, but you have code accumulation, but no code removal. And so it just gets to become basically archaic bloatware after a while. And it's just, it makes it hard for things to progress. So I don't know, maybe Mars, you'd have like any given law must have a sunset, and require active voting to keep it up there, And I actually also say, like, and these are just, I don't know, recommendations or thoughts, and ultimately will be up to the people on Mars to decide. But I think it should be easier to remove a law than to add one because of just to overcome the inertia of laws. So maybe it's like, for argument's sake, you need like, say, 60% vote to have a law take effect, but only a 40% vote to remove it.
Do you think there's a role for policy, for governments to step in to help with policy to create a better world?
Absolutely. And the governments don't have to believe unemployment will go up. And they don't have to believe automation will be this fast to do something. Revamping vocational school would be one example. Another is if there's a big gap in healthcare service employment, and we know that a country's population is growing older, more longevity, living older, because people over 80 require 5 times as much care as those under 80, then it is a good time to incent training programs for elderly care, to find ways to improve the pay. Maybe one way would be to offer as part of Medicare or the equivalent program for people over 80 to be entitled to a few hours of elderly care at home. And then that might be reimbursable, and that will stimulate the service industry around the policy.
Do you have concerns about large entities, whether it's governments or companies, controlling the future of AI development in general? So we talked about companies. Do you have a better sense that governments can better represent the interests of the people than companies? Or do you believe companies are better at representing the interests of the people? Or is there no easy answer?
I don't think there's an easy answer because it's a double-edged sword. The companies and governments can provide better services with more access to data and more access to AI, but that also leads to greater power, which can lead to uncontrollable problems, whether it's monopoly or corruption in the government. So I think one has to be careful to look at how much data that companies and governments have, and some kind of checks and balances would be helpful.
Is there some version of the alien conversation that could incorporate the breaking of frameworks?
Well, I think so. I mean, the key question would be, we've had the Pentagon release multiple videos of strange UFOs that undermined a lot of us. I just think it's also really fascinating to talk about the fact that those of us who were trained to call BS on all of this stuff just had the rug pulled out from under us by the Pentagon choosing to do this. And you know what the effect of that is? You've opened the door for every stupid theory known to man. My aunt saw a ghost. Okay, now we're going to have to listen to, well, hey, the Pentagon used to deny it. Then it turned out there were UFOs, dude. Whoever is in charge of lying to the public, they need a cost function that incorporates the damage and trust. Because I held this line that this was all garbage and all BS. Now I don't know what to think.
There's a fascinating aspect to this alien discussion, the breaking of frameworks, that involves the release of videos from the Pentagon, which is almost like another dimension that trust in itself, or the nature of truth and information, is a kind of dimension along which we're traveling constantly. That is messing with my head to think about, because I mean, because it almost feels like you need to incorporate that into your study of the nature of reality. Is like the constant shifting of the notation, the tools we use to communicate that reality. And so, like, what am I supposed to think about these videos? Is it a complete distraction? Is it a kind of cosmic joke?
I don't know, but you know what? I'm tired of these people. Just completely tired of these people.
The people on the Pentagon side, or the people who are interpreting the stuff on the Pentagon side?
I'm tired of the authorities playing games with what we can know. The fact that you and I do you have a security clearance?
Some level of it because I was funded for DARPA for a while.
I don't have a security clearance. You know, I am going to release whatever theory I have. And my guess is that there is zero interest from our own government. And so the Chinese will find out about it the same time our government does, because Lord knows what they do in these buildings. I watch crazy people walk in and out of the intelligence community, walk in and out of DARPA. And I think, wow, you're talking to that person? That's really fascinating to me. We don't seem to have a clue as to who might have the ball.
Complete lack of transparency. Do you think it's possible the government is in possession of something deeply fundamental to our understanding of the world that they're not releasing? So this is one thing this is one of the famous distractions that people play with, the narrative.
Assume that were true.
Of alien life forms, spacecraft in possession, that the government is in possession of alien spacecraft. That's
Assume
the
that
popular
were true.
narrative. Yeah.
I don't think the government really exists at the moment. I believe, and this is not an idea that was original to me. There was a guy named Michael Teitelbaum who used to be at the Sloan Foundation. And at some point, I pointed out that the U.S. government had completely contradictory objectives when it came to the military and science. And one branch said this, one branch said that. I said, I don't understand which is true. What does the government want? He said, you think there's a government? And I said, what do you mean? He said, what makes you think that the people in those two offices have ever coordinated? What is it that allows each office to have a coherent plan with respect to every other office? And that's when I first started to understand that there are periods where the government coheres, and then there are periods where the coherence just decays. And I think that that's been going on since 1945, that there have been a few places where there's been increased coherence, but in general, everything is just getting less and less coherent. And that what war did was focus us on the need to have a government, a people, a mission, capacity, technology, commitment, ideology. And then as soon as that was gone, different people, those who'd been through World War II had one set of beliefs, those born in the 1950s, or late 40s, by the time they got to Woodstock, they didn't buy any of that.
So coherence is the complete opposite of of bureaucracy, being paralyzed by bureaucracy. So coherence is efficient, functional government, because when you say there's no government, meaning there's no emergent function from a collection of individuals. It's just a bunch of individuals stuck in their offices without any kind of efficient communication with each other on a single mission. And so a government that is truly at the epitome of what a government is supposed to be is when a bunch of people working together on a single
What are we
mission.
about? Are we about freedom? Are we about growth? Are we about decency and fairness? Are we about the absence of a national culture so that we can all just do our own thing? I've called this thing the USAN, the United States of Absolutely Nothing. These are all different visions for our country.
So it's possible that there's a alien spacecraft somewhere, and there's 20 people that know about it, and then they're kind of as you communicate further and further into the offices, that information dissipates, it gets distorted in some kind of way, and then it's completely lost. The possibility of that information is lost.
We bought a house, and I had this idea that I wanted to find out what all the switches did. And I quickly found out that your house doesn't keep updating its plans. As people do modifications, they just do the modifications and they don't actually record why they were doing what they were doing or what things lead to. So there are all sorts of bizarre, there's a switch in my house that says privacy. I don't know what privacy is. Does it turn on an electromagnetic field does some lead shielding go over the house? That's what we have. We have a system in which the people who've inherited these structures have no idea why they're granted.
What do you think? Just philosophizing, what kind of mechanisms of government do you think we as a species should be evolving with, U.S. or broadly? What do you think will work well as a system? Of course, we don't know. It all seems to work pretty crappily. Some things worse than others. Some people argue that communism is the best. Others say, yeah, look at the Soviet Union. Some people argue that anarchy is the best, and then completely discarding the positive effects of government. There's a lot of arguments. U.S. seems to be doing pretty damn well in the span of history. There's respect for human rights, which seems to be a nice feature, not a bug. And economically, a lot of growth, a lot of technological development. People seem to be relatively kind on the grand scheme of things. Mm-hmm. What lessons do you draw from that? What kind of government system do you think is good?
Ideally, government should
not be perceivable, right? It should be frictionless. The more you notice the influence of the government, the more friction you experience, the less effective and efficient the government probably is, right? So a government, game theoretically, is an agent that imposes an offset on your payout metrics to make your Nash equilibrium compatible with the common good. Right, so you have these situations where people
that's like
act
a
on their
haiku.
local incentives.
Yeah.
And these local incentives, everybody does the thing that's locally the best for them, but the global outcome is not good. And this is even the case when people care about the global outcome, because a regulation mechanisms exists that creates a causal relationship between what I want to have for the global good and what I do. So for instance, if I think that we should fly less and I stay at home, there's not a single plane that is going to not start because of me, right? It's not going to have an influence, but I don't get from A to B. So the way to implement this would basically to have a government that is sharing this idea that we should fly less and is then imposing a regulation that, for instance, makes flying more expensive and it gives incentives for inventing other forms of transportation that are less putting that strain on the environment, for instance.
So there's going to be a moment, if Bitcoin continues to grow in its impact, when governments are going to seriously contend with, what do we do with this? Do you think about those moments? Is Bitcoin, is the cryptocurrency world in general going to be able to withstand the serious legal pushback from countries, from nations, especially authoritarian nations?
Yeah, so it's been interesting. It's been 12 years, okay? More than 12 years since Satoshi Nakamoto created Bitcoin. And they haven't been able to stop it. They have tried. They have tried a lot. I wrote a long essay for Quillette on this. Like, why haven't governments been able to stop Bitcoin? And my thesis is essentially that there's been like this mix of different kind of technical, social, and economic and political incentives and disincentives that make it very difficult. And I think to me, the best way to think about it is that Bitcoin's like a Trojan horse. So just to actually tell that story just a little bit, because I think it's important to understand the classical mythology tale. I find this very interesting.
Of the actual
Trojan horse, yeah, which was told in the Aeneid actually by Virgil, right? And the idea was the Greeks had been like trying to take the city of Troy for like a decade at these like impregnable walls, and they couldn't do it. And Ulysses and the rest of the Greek army were like, we don't know what to do. So Minerva, the god of strategy and war, kind of like they get this idea from her, I guess, to actually try to use subterfuge and trickery to take over the city. So the idea is and this was sort of hatched by Ulysses, right, to put this horse together that would kind of be like a gift. So the idea was the Greeks just like pretended to leave, right? They deserted. They left behind one soldier and this horse. And the Trojans looked at it and they were like, what is going on here? And they brought in the soldier, and the soldier's like, look, they left. They're so sorry for all of the desecration and blood spill. This is their gift to you. It's, honoring Minerva. It's like this, trophy for you guys. Yeah. And there were actually people inside Troy, Cassandra, a prophet, as well as Laocoon, who was like a priest, who said, no, this is obviously a trick. This is obviously a trick. But they were like dispatched and ignored because the horse was like, it was just like so badass. So the Trojans were like, bringing it in the city. So they brought it in themselves. No blood spilled at all, right? In the middle of the night, of course, what you realize is the horse was packed with Greek soldiers, and they come out and they let the army in, which was like hiding behind an island. So this idea that like something could be so attractive that you really can't say no, even if you know what's inside of it, is at play in Bitcoin. So like in Bitcoin has this number go up technology, right? It is what we call it in sort of shorthand, NGU, right? But what people don't realize is that NGU is like the Trojan horse. Inside the Trojan horse is FGU, freedom go up technology. So dictators and rogue regimes and corporations are going to buy, mine, tax, accumulate this thing because it's the best performing financial asset in the world. What they don't realize, or they're going to have to ignore, is that they're also aiding and abetting this freedom technology, which allows individuals to be sovereign and eventually erodes their power. There's no question that rogue regimes and bad actors have already used and will continue to use Bitcoin. The thing is, when you think about a North Korea or a Venezuela, and that government instructs some of its bureaucrats and cronies and officials to start stealing Bitcoin or accumulating it or whatever, for short-term gain to get around sanctions and use it to buy dollars or something like that, right? Which they can't get normally. Well, guess what? All those people who the regime has instructed to like figure this thing out and use it, they're all going to realize, oh my God, this is money the government doesn't control. And it's going to spread like a virus, okay? So this is like the idea of the Trojan horse allegory, why I think it's so important and powerful with Bitcoin. All the people talking about Bitcoin today on TV, they don't care about freedom or privacy. They just care about number go up. But what they don't realize is what's concealed within. And that's very, very powerful to me.
So the people talking about Bitcoin on TV are maybe investor types.
Professional investors, corporations, and soon governments. I mean, you just had today, this morning on CNBC, the leader of the Republican leader of the House of Representatives, a congressman, saying like we need to be pro-Bitcoin as a country. And the other day, Peter Thiel had a very interesting comment where he was basically like, let's not fall behind China in this race. So you have influential people in our government, like sort of posturing for this like, Bitcoin race that's going to happen in the next 10 years. You're going to see this. Countries are going to compete to stack Bitcoin. Absolutely.
So you believe the thing that's shiny and sexy, like the Trojan horse, is the number go up.
It's too hard to ignore.
And to define that a little further, meaning is it does seem like the more people get excited and start using Bitcoin, the more of its value grows. So it's just a good
feedback loop.
Yeah, it's a feedback loop. And then the reason you're excited about it, especially, is the
freedom go up.
Freedom go up, which is it ultimately gives power to the individuals to decentralize.
Yeah, I mean, like
system.
When Tesla stacks Bitcoin, they're just doing that as self-interest. They think it's going to be a good inflation hedge. Fine. But what they maybe don't care about, don't realize, or they don't need to care. I mean, Bitcoin's power is it like co-opts people into promoting a freedom tool, even if they don't care about, or even if they hate freedom. It doesn't matter. So when Tesla stacks Bitcoin and the price goes up and more interest goes up and more people around the world are like, wow, Bitcoin, then more people get involved. Again, more adoption, more price, more developers, better user interface, more privacy tools, more mining, more network security. It's just this like positive feedback loop that continues to grow, and it will grow intensely in the next decade as we go through the adoption cycle. And the reason why I'm so excited about this is the human rights world. Again, to get back to our previous conversation, it is very hard to find people who have the empathy or the altruism to actually make a difference abroad in places like China or Saudi Arabia or North Korea. People are very quick to they'll just quickly toss off the pretty words that they care about human rights as soon as profits come into play. So there's no alignment of incentives, right? The reason why Bitcoin is so powerful is that it aligns the incentives. All of a sudden, they can be as greedy as they want. They are being forced to promote a freedom tool. This I've never seen before, and it gives me a lot of like excitement. It's very refreshing because we've been laboring in the human rights space. You have to like raise money, and it's all like nonprofit work, and you're like begging for people to make a difference for you. Here you have this like incredible asset, which people will accumulate out of self-preservation, self-interest, and greed, and yet it will strengthen the power of the individual. That is what we need to fight Big Brother. That's what we need to fight. Like what I'm scared is happening in China, like this growing authoritarian state, which is powered by big data analysis. This is our way to fight back. And it runs on this like really interesting engine, again, that like takes advantage of our base nature as humans. Mm-hmm. And I know that it sounds terrible for me to say this, but I mean, ultimately we are self-interested, and it is hard to get people to care about others living 1,000 miles away. We are kind of localized in our empathy. Speaking as someone who works to help people who live in like 100 different countries, it's very difficult to get Americans to care about what's happening in Belarus or in Kashmir. It just is. But guess what? They're going to definitely care about Bitcoin because they want to see their net worth go up. They want to do better for their family, etc. They're going to get into this thing, and it's really going to like make that powerful tool for everyone else who's using it. So this interplay dynamic is fascinating to me.
Yeah, I have to. So I'm somebody who doesn't like the corrupting effects of greed, but it is also human nature.
Yeah, I don't like it either. But we have to be realists here.
You have to acknowledge it and then maybe use it for your advantage.
And it's not just Bitcoin itself. Like exchanges today are adopting something called Lightning Network, which is a way to scale Bitcoin on a second layer. Much like we had gold bars, which we scaled with paper money, and then we had Visa credit cards, which were a way of scaling the paper notes. Bitcoin scales through Lightning Network. It's a private, instant, globally final settlement network. It's something you all should check out. It's very, very interesting. The exchanges aren't adopting Lightning for its privacy benefits. Like Lightning operates off the chain, meaning surveillance companies can't do chain analysis on Lightning because it's on an onion routed second layer, that works kind of like the Tor project. The exchanges don't care about privacy. They're doing it because it reduces fees. Lightning is cheaper and faster. So again, we have this really interesting alignment of incentives where like the freedom tech is being promoted by people who it doesn't matter what their incentives are. I could care less if they were altruistic or not. And I think this is, and you're going to maybe see this even in the future. There's more things coming in Bitcoin down the pike. Lightning was enabled by an upgrade called SegWit, right, which took place a few years ago, which was the culmination of the block size conflict. Mm-hmm. There's another thing coming up called cross-input signature aggregation, which may, if it takes effect in the next few years, it may compel exchanges to collaboratively spend all their Bitcoin together in a way that really protects our privacy and fights surveillance. But they're not going to do it for moral reasons. They're going to do it because it's going to save them money and improve their bottom line.
Can you speak to that kind of collaborative so that you can have multiple parties in a single transaction kind of thing?
Yeah, like you could do that today. Absolutely. It's called a coin join, for example. But right now it's more expensive to coin join in Bitcoin. You have to pay a premium for your privacy. This would flip that on its head and would basically say, if you have one transaction, hey, pile them all in, have as many parties as you want. The more parties you get in, the cheaper it's going to be per party. Okay. And that's not possible in Bitcoin today, but it might be in the future. But again, the beauty in Bitcoin are these these ways that it just aligns human incentives and it aligns our like most base desires and needs and realities with like freedom and privacy. And that I've never seen before. And that's why I think it's so interesting.
So something that somebody like Eric Weinstein actually spoke to this on the topic of Snowden and the NSA. What should we be thinking about? Because that feels like already an outdated set of conversations because of the information we've gotten from the past. Well, it feels like everything's gotten quiet now in terms of how much we actually know about the...
Hugely important. I think the two lessons from Snowden are the Patriot Act and the war on terror and mass surveillance are not necessary for our democracy and for our freedoms. This was a false choice. We never had to sacrifice them to be safer. And we've seen that. Government has spent hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars on these like surveillance programs that you can read about have amounted to very little, except for tremendous bureaucratic waste and erosion of our freedoms. But at the same time, we need to practice more privacy. And the dramatic increase in the usage of Signal, for example, has been really, really great to see. It's fantastic that tens of millions of people are downloading Signal and using it. You should try to be onboarding more and more of your conversations onto Signal, for example, where governments can't see what you're saying. Maybe they can see the metadata. Maybe they can see that your phone number sent a message to someone else's phone number at this time, but they can't see what's inside. So using encryption in your life is very, very important. That's a good starting point. I would say that's kind of step A.
The ideas of democracy, the ideas of the balance of power, all the ideas that we were talking about, the constructs, were inventions. I wonder if there's other inventions that will allow us to sort of not give governments or any centralized institutions so much power. Like, why do citizens have to use Signal? Why? Because that's an effort. Because you have to like understand exactly why. So that's a nice little solution for a particular set of problems. But like, there's a million other ways that data, I'm sure, is being collected constantly. If we don't create a system that prevents the establishments of these centralized powers, then we'll always have this problem.
Yeah, I think we can keep it simple for the purposes of this conversation. You have politics, information, and money. Those are the three things I would encourage us to focus on. In politics, yes, someone invented democracy. I mean, whether it was the Greeks, or the West Africans, or many others around the world around the same time invented this idea that we should be ruled by rules and not by rulers, right? Yeah. And that has evolved dramatically, right? And then you have information. Information also used to be highly centralized, right? Think about how rich you had to be to gain access to a library before the printing press, or how much money you had to have, or how close to the king or the feudal lord you had to be able to have that ability. But now, the majority of the world, billions of people, have access to all information in their pocket, and they can set up an account on social media and get their word out. So not only politics, but information has been dramatically decentralized. And I would say that encrypted messaging is kind of a corollary to that second innovation, in as much as now people are like more effortlessly, like Signal is a lot easier to use than PGP, for example. Mm-hmm. They're more easily able to practice privacy when it comes to having private messages globally. These are all good things, and we need to keep pushing. And I think money is, like, honestly, maybe the most important piece. And that's why I spent so much time thinking about Bitcoin.
Okay, so can you, like Wikipedia style, or maybe like in a musical form, like I'm Only a Bill, describe to me...
I still sing that to my head sometimes. I'm just a bill.
I don't know what the rest of the song goes, but let's leave that to people's imagination. How does this whole thing work? How does the U.S. political system work? The three branches how do you think about the system we have now? If you were to try to describe, if aliens showed up and asked you, like, they didn't have time, so this is an elevator thing. Like, should we destroy you and be, as you plead to avoid destruction? Well, how would you describe how this thing works?
I would say we come together and we pick the people who make our laws. Then we pick the guy who executes those laws. And they together pick the people who determine whether they or the president is breaking the law at the most basic level. That's how I would describe it. Right? So that's the people who make the laws are Congress. Mm-hmm. The executive is charged with executing the laws as passed by Congress, the branches of government. And the Supreme Court is picked by the president, confirmed by the Senate, which then decides whether you or other people are breaking the law in terms of interpretation of that law. That's basically it. Oh, and they decide whether those laws are they fall within the restrictions and the want of the founders as expressed by the Constitution of the United States, which is a set of principles that we came together in 1787. I want to make sure I get this right. 1787, and decided that we were going to live the rest of our lives barring a revolution and more. And we've made it 200 and something years under that system.
So there's a balance of power. There's, because you have multiple branches, there's a tension and a balance to it as designed by those original documents. Which is the most dysfunctional of the branches? Which is your favorite? Like, in terms of talking about systems and like, what's the greatest of concern and what is the greatest source of benefit in your view?
The presidency, the presidency is my favorite to study, obviously, because it is the one where there's most subject to variable change in terms of the personality involved, because of so much power imbued within the executive. The Senate is actually pretty much the same. That's one of the things I love about reading about the Senate and histories of the Senate is you're like, oh yeah, there were always like assholes in the Senate who were doing their thing and filibustering constantly based upon this or that. And then the personalities involved with the Senate haven't mattered as much since like pre-Civil War, right? Like pre-Civil War, you had like Henry Clay and then Daniel Webster and John C. Calhoun, who even in their own way, they represented like larger constituencies and they crafted these like compromises up until the outbreak of the Civil War, etc. But like post since then, you don't think about like the titans within the Senate. Most of that is because a lot of the stuff that they had power over has transferred over to the executive. So I'm most interested in really in like power, like where it lies. It's actually pretty, throughout American history, much more used to lie with Congress. Now it's obviously just so imbued within the executive that understanding executive power is, I think, the thing I'm probably...
Do you think there's concrete groups? Like, is it as simple as the two groups of blue and red?
No, it's also very fluid, because you and I are allied as Jewish people, as Russians, as males, as podcasters, You're an academic. I'm not. We're different, but we each are a Venn diagram, even within ourselves. And I can talk to you about politics, and then we can talk about Russia stuff, and then you could talk about your work, which I don't know anything about. So that would be where you're way up here and I'm way down here. So there's every relationship with just between individuals, it's very dynamic.
So how do we secede? Like, how do we form individual states where there's a little bit more cohesion?
Sure. And voluntary cohesion. So the first step is to eliminate the concept of political authority as legitimate, and to denigrate and humiliate those who would put themselves in a position in which they are there to tell you how to live your life from any semblance of validity. And that's starting to happen. If you look at what they had with the lockdowns, Cuomo and de Blasio in New York, I was tired a couple weeks ago. And I said to my friend, oh, just click, maybe I have COVID. And he goes, it's not possible. I go, what do you mean? And he goes, we haven't had any deaths in like 2 months. And there's only like 100 cases a day for like 2 months. And I go, you're exaggerating, because everything was still closed. Mm-hmm. And I looked at the numbers and he wasn't exaggerating. And there's no greater American dream to me than an immigrant family comes to the States, forms their own little business. Maybe mom's a good cook, it's a restaurant, dry cleaner, fruit stand. And those people aren't going to have a lot of money. Those are the first ones who lost their companies because of these lockdowns. Cuomo, who's the governor of New York, opened up the gyms. He said, you're clear to open up. De Blasio said, we don't have enough inspectors. You're going to have to wait another couple of weeks. To regard that as anything other than literally criminal is something that I am having a harder and harder time wrapping my head around.
You said, that's something I'm deeply worried about as well, which is like thousands, it's actually millions of dreams being crushed. That American dream of starting a business, of running a business.
What about all the young people who you and I have in our audiences who are socially isolated at best, and now they can't leave their homes? Isolation and ostracism are things that are very well studied in psychology. These have extreme consequences. I read a book called Ostracism, and this wasn't scientific, but basically the author was a psychiatrist, psychologist, whatever. And he had one of his colleagues, they did an experiment. Let's for a week, you ostracize me completely. We know and he goes, even knowing it's the experiment, the fact that he wouldn't make eye contact with me and the fact that he ignored me had an extreme emotional impact on me, knowing full well this is purely for experimental purposes. Now you multiply that by all these, the number of kids who were thinking about suicide was through the roof during all this. And my point is, until these people, I would predict like 2024, that's where we're going to have to start having conversations about what personal consequences have to be done for these people, because until then, they're going to do the same thing.
So you think there's going to be society-wide consequences of this that we're going to see, like ripple effects because of the social isolation?
I know. I mean, we also need to talk about consequences for Cuomo and de Blasio. Because if politicians respond to incentives, and the incentives are there for them to be extremely conservative, because if you have to choose, as Cuomo said in a press conference, between 1,000 people dying and 1,000 people losing their business, it's not a hard choice, and he's right. But at a certain point, it's like, all right, you're losing both. You're you're making these decisions and not having consequences for it, and you're going to do it again the next time. So we need to make sure you're a little scared.
Okay.
And I don't know what that would mean.
But you're laying this problem, this incompetence.
I don't think it's incompetence. I think it's very competent. I think their job is
malevolence.
Yes,
but you're laying it not at the hands of the individuals, but the structure of government.
It's both. Yes.
How would we deal with it better without centralized control?
Well, we didn't really have centralized control because every country and every state, handled it in a different mechanism.
But a city has centralized control.
Right.
I mean,
no, that's not true. So Cuomo and de Blasio, they had a lot of disagreements over the months, and this was actually a source of great interest and tension. De Blasio at one point was talking about like quarantining people in their homes. Cuomo was like, "You're crazy." Same thing with the schools, same thing with the gyms, and there were other such examples. But the point being, this was an emergency. This is World War I talked about this on Tim Pool's show, was very dangerous because it gave a lot of evil people some very useful information about what the country would put up with and what they can get away with under wartime. And this set the model for things like the New Deal and the other things of that nature. it is undeniable, and you're a scientist, so you understand this perfectly well, that this lockdown gave some very nefarious people some very valid data about how much people will put up with under pressures from the state.
It's an illusion.
The idea, and I apologize, I overstretched the use of the word government. The idea is there should be some punishment from the people when a group, when a bureaucracy, when a set of people or a particular leader, like in an authoritarian regime, which more than half the world currently lives under, if you if they stop representing the people, it stops being like a Berkeley meeting and starts being more like a dictatorial kind of situation. And so the point is, it's nice to give people, the populace, in a decentralized way, power to resist that kind of like government becoming over authoritarian.
Yeah, but people see this idea that the problem is always the government being powerful is false. The problem can also be criminal gangs. The problem can also be weird cults. The problem can be abusive clergy. The problem can be infrastructure that fails. The problem can be poisoned water. The problem can be failed electric grids. The problem can be a crappy education system that makes the whole society less and less able to create value. There are all these other problems that are different from an overbearing government. Like, you have to keep some sense of perspective and not be obsessed with only one kind of problem, because then the others will pop up.
But empirically speaking, some problems are bigger than others. So like some groups of people, like governments or gangs or companies lead to
Are you a U.S. citizen?
Yes.
Has the government ever really been a problem for you?
Well, okay. So first of all, I grew up in the Soviet Union. And actually,
yeah, my wife did too.
So I have seen,
sure.
And has the government bothered me? I would say that that's a really complicated question, especially because the United States is it's a special place. Yeah, like a lot of other countries. But
my wife's family were refuseniks, and so we have like her dad was sent to the Gulag. For what it's worth, on my father's side, all but a few were killed by a pogrom in post-Soviet pogrom in Ukraine. So
I would say, because you did a little trick of eloquent trick of language that you switched to the United States to talk about government. So I believe, unlike my friend Michael Malice, who's an anarchist, I believe government can do a lot of good in the world. That is exactly what you're saying, which is it's politics. The thing that Bitcoin folks and cryptocurrency folks argue is that one of the big ways that government can control the populace is a centralized bank, like control the money. That was the case in the Soviet Union too. There's, inflation can really make poor people suffer. And so what they argue is this is one way to go around that power that government has of controlling the monetary system. So that's a way to resist. That's not actually saying government bad. That's saying some of the ways that central banks get into trouble can be resisted through decentralized.
So let me ask you, on balance today in the real world, in terms of actual facts, do you think cryptocurrencies are doing more to prop up corrupt, murderous, horrible regimes, or to resist those regimes? Where do you think the balance is right now?
I know exactly, having talked to a lot of cryptocurrency folks, what they would tell me, right? It's hard.
I'm asking it as a real question. There's no way to know the answer perfectly.
There's no way to know the answer perfectly.
However, I got to say, if you look at people who've been able to decode blockchains, and they do leak a lot of data. They're not as secure as is widely thought. There are a lot of unknown Bitcoin whales from pretty early, and they're huge. And if you ask, who are these people? There's evidence that a lot of them are quite not the people you'd want to support, let's say. And I just don't, I think empirically this idea that there's some intrinsic way that bad governments will will be disempowered, and people will be able to resist them more than new villains or even villainous governments will be empowered. There's no basis for that assertion. It just is kind of circumstantial. And I think in general, Bitcoin ownership is one thing, but Bitcoin transactions have tended to support criminality more than productivity.
Of course, they would argue that was the story of its early days, that now more and more Bitcoin is being used for legitimate transactions. But
that's the difference. I didn't say for legitimate transactions. I said for economic growth, for creativity. Like, sure. I think what's happening is people are using it a little bit for buying. I don't know, maybe companies make it available for this and that. And you buy a Tesla with it or something.
Yeah.
Investing in a startup, hard. It might have happened a little bit, but it's not an engine of productivity, creativity, and economic growth. Sure. Whereas old-fashioned currency still is. So, and anyway, I think I'm pro the idea of digital currencies.
Sure.
I'm anti the idea of economics wiping out politics as a result. I think they have to exist in some balance to avoid the worst dysfunctions of each.
In some ways, there's parallels to our discussion of algorithms and cryptocurrency. Is you're pro the idea, but it can be used to manipulate. You can be used poorly by aforementioned humans.
Well, I think that you can make better designs and worse designs.
Sure.
And I think, the thing about cryptocurrency that's so interesting is how many of us are responsible for the poor designs because we're all so hooked on that Horatio Alger story on I'm going to be the one who gets the viral benefit. Way back when all this stuff was starting, I remember it would have been in the 80s, somebody had the idea of using viral as a metaphor for network effect. And the whole point was to talk about how bad network effect was, that it always created distortions that ruined the usefulness of economic incentives, that created dangerous distortions. But then somehow, even after the pandemic, we think of viral as this good thing because we imagine ourselves as the virus, right? We want to be on the beneficiary side of it. But of course, you're not likely to be.
There is a sense, because money is involved, people are not reasoning clearly always, because they want to be part of that first viral wave that makes them rich, and that blinds people from their basic morality.
I had an interesting conversation. I sort of feel like I should respect some people's privacy, but some of the initial people who started Bitcoin, I remember having an argument about it's intrinsically a Ponzi scheme. The early people have more than the later people. And the further down the chain you get, the more you're subject to gambling-like dynamics, where it's more and more random and more subject to weird network effects and whatnot, unless you're a very small player, perhaps, and you're just buying something. But even then, you'll be subject to fluctuations because the whole thing is just kind of as it fluctuates, it's going to wave around the little people more. And I remember the conversation turned to gambling, because gambling is a pretty large economic sector. And it's always struck me as being non-productive. Somebody goes to Las Vegas and they lose money. And so one argument is, well, they got entertainment. They paid for entertainment as they lost money, so that's fine. And Las Vegas does up the losing of money in an entertaining way, so why not? It's like going to a show. So that's one argument. The argument that was made to me was different from that. It's that, no, what they're doing is they're getting a chance to experience hope. And a lot of people don't get that chance. And so that's really worth it. Even if they're going to lose, they have that moment of hope, and they need to be able to experience that. And it's a very interesting argument.
That's so heartbreaking, because I've seen that. That I have that a little bit of a sense. I've talked to some young people who invest in cryptocurrency, and what I see is this hope. This is the first thing that gave them hope, and that's so heartbreaking to me. That you've gotten hope from so much is invested. It's like hope from somehow becoming rich, as opposed to something, to me, I apologize, but money is in the long term not going to be a source of that deep meaning. It's good to have enough money, but it should not be the source of hope.
Mm-hmm.
And it's heartbreaking to me how many people it's a source of hope.
Yeah. You've just described the psychology of virality, or the psychology of trying to base a civilization on semi-random occurrences of network effect peaks.
Yeah.
And it doesn't really work. I mean, I think we need to get away from that. We need to soften those peaks. And except Microsoft, which deserves every penny, but in every